I turned 35 in a dining room that looked like it was trying too hard to be kind. The bulbs were dimmed just enough to make everyone's faces look a little guilty. The table runner was a tasteful gray that pretended to soothe the leftover arguments, and the cake was pink, in the way a secret blush is pink soft pastel, slightly too perfect. My mother held her phone up to record me smiling hard enough to pull the corners of the night into her orbit. My father cleared his throat like a metronome. My sister Paige tapped her nails against her water glass, bored, or nervous, or both. My husband Ryan gave me that half grin he uses when he wants me to know he's on my side. And my daughter, 12-year-old Zoe, slid her cool fingers into my hand under the table and whispered without ceremony, "Don't eat the cake." She didn't say it like a joke or a dare. She said it like a fact with a siren inside. I told myself I was being dramatic, and then, in almost the same breath, I believed her. I always have. I knocked Ryan's fork out of his hand so clumsily it became slapstick. Pretended I was clumsy. Pretended I needed the bathroom. Pretended everything, except the one thing I knew my daughter had just thrown me a lifeline, and the only way to catch it was to act like nothing was happening. In the bathroom, pressed flat against the door, I called her but didn't speak. "We're playing chess," I thought. "Think like Zoe." When she picked up, I whispered, "Text." The message arrived before my pulse could slow. "Heard Grandma and Aunt Paige in the kitchen. Are you sure the cake will work?" "Yes, they won't be able to go tomorrow. A whole life can tilt on 10 words if the fulcrum is trust." I walked back to the table with a smile that didn't fit my face. The cake slices waited beautiful and false as doll's food. Mom chirped that it was vanilla almond my favorite, and then with the timing of a script she'd rehearsed, added that she wouldn't have any because of sugar. Paige announced keto. Dad wasn't hungry. The air went viscous. Ryan could feel the room changing temperatures too. His eyes asked me a question I refused to answer in front of anyone. I said brightly that I'd save mine for later, and everybody pretended this was ordinary. 17 minutes passed between Zoe's whisper and the knock at the door. They stretched like taffy sweet and terrible, and strangely sticky, full of second guesses that never quite landed, because the truth had already chosen a corner and sat down. When I opened the door, 2 officers stood there with the kind of neutral calm that can dismantle a life without raising its voice. "We received a report," the older one said, polite and unhurried. Behind me, the dining room fell into the kind of silence that throws its weight around. Zoe stood. "I called," she said. My mother's smile cracked at the edges. Paige's chair shrieked against the floor as she jumped to her feet, sputtering about crime shows and overactive imaginations. The officers asked who brought the cake. My mother lifted her chin and said she had. When they explained they would be taking the cake to test, she said it wasn't poison in that careful, too-quick tone of someone trying to outrun a sentence. She called it something that would only upset our stomachs, temporary, harmless, a nudge. Ryan stood as if pulled by a string. "We'd have stayed home," he said, finishing her thought for her. She winced like we were overreacting to a staple she'd used 1,000 times. The officers thanked her for her honesty and told her not to leave town. The cruise she wanted so much was suddenly a shoreline she wouldn't touch. They bagged the cake like a confession and left us to the echo. I'd like to say I felt vindicated, but the feeling was smaller and lonelier than that. It was as if a lid had been lifted from the life I'd been living, and the steam escaped, and now I could see the shape of the pot. The thing about nights like that is they expand to contain more than themselves. As I stood in the kitchen afterward, running hot water over a glass I wasn't washing, the past wandered in and sat down at the counter. My mother has always believed in redistributing happiness like it was sugar she could move around the pantry. When I was 4 and my sister was 2, Paige wanted my matted stuffed rabbit, and I learned a lesson I would never be allowed to unlearn. You're the big sister. She's little. Let her have it. Every version of that rabbit followed me, the sweater I waited months for that suddenly required taking turns, which meant it was hers. The English essays that slid across the table with a sigh and a promise that it was just this once even when it wasn't. The way no one called it stealing my time or voice when I wrote her paragraphs and she got the credit because the family had decided I was the vending machine that accepted all forms of desperation. And when it stopped being schoolwork and started being money, the vocabulary didn't change. A between-jobs stipend of $200 a month became a ritual with a calendar invite. My parents called it love. I called it something else in my head and then felt bad for naming it. Saying no felt like flipping off a priest. Then came the cruise, the legacy event, the one with the group folder full of sunset pictures that hadn't happened yet. We had already paid our share. Paige had not. The phone calls came with polite words arranged over a thesis that never changed: be a good sister. For the first time in my life, I refused. The silence that followed was not empty. It was a planning session. If I had been paying attention, I might have recognized its shape. But I was busy building a new muscle called a boundary, and those grow slowly. When the officers left, Zoe leaned into me and we stayed that way for a long moment. I wanted to be angry to make a speech to tell my mother that every small theft had prepared me to recognize this larger one, but I didn't have the appetite for theater. The house got very quiet, and in that quiet, I promised myself something small and radiant. Listen to your daughter first. The next morning, we packed. The world hadn't ended, only rearranged itself. My parents weren't coming. That fact swung in the air like a porch light left on after a party. On the way out the door, as the sun climbed the front of our house like it was rehearsing a better day, I realized that what I felt most wasn't triumph or rage. It was relief. I hadn't swallowed the proof that nothing had ever really changed. I had wanted my 30s to give me certainty. Instead, they offered me a mirror and a choice. I took the mirror. Type, continue to receive the next part. On the ship, the ocean acted like it didn't care who had almost participated in a crime to make a vacation happen. It should have felt like a joke, but the water kept being the water blue-gray patient, hushing everything that tried to be louder than it. Our relatives trickled into the lobby like actors wandering into a play, halfway through the second act, ready to swap gossip and clink glasses. I told myself to keep quiet, not because silence had served me well before, but because I was tired of carrying the weight of other people's reactions. Zoe lasted 9 minutes. In the corridor outside our cabin, a cousin asked where my parents were and whether Paige had picked a shore excursion. Zoe replied that Grandma and Aunt Paige had tried to poison us. The word landed with the wrong kind of splash. When the cousin blinked and said, "Sorry, what?" Zoe repeated herself with the even tone of a weather report and then walked off to find the pool. Ryan stared at the carpet and then at me, waiting for me to mediate the universe. I took a breath that turned into a laugh that turned into a long exhale. "She's not wrong," I said, because lying takes more energy than I had. It didn't take long for the story to move like weather through group chats and deck chairs. I decided not to chase it. I ordered coffee that tasted like scorched hope and watched the shoreline roll itself into a ribbon. By dinner, I had caught the sentence. If it's true, she's got a point. Paige has been freeloading for years, unfurling from an uncle's mouth as if he'd been storing it for a decade. And I realized that family secrets are never as secret as the keepers imagine. Everyone knows something. Everyone is waiting for permission to say it. I didn't feel like handing out permission slips, so I went to the rail and let the wind talk. The more I tried not to think about the cake, the more the cake thought about me. I kept cycling through the alternate timeline, where I put my fork down simply because my mother was filming, and I wanted to be gracious where I woke up at 3 a.m. Sweating and sick, where the trip we had saved for turned into cancellation fees, while my mother told herself a story about love that required me to be physically miserable. That version of the trip made my real stomach pitch. If care requires the erasure of the person being cared for, it isn't care. It's choreography for an audience that votes silently. On deck 3, near a cluster of fake plants doing their best, I found a chair by a round window and read a book whose sentences couldn't compete with my thoughts. A woman about my age sat in the next chair. She had the kind of kind face that makes you want to hold your breath. I recognized her from a holiday in some cousin's slideshow years ago. She didn't introduce herself. She just asked, quiet and without nosiness, "Are you all right?" I told her the truth, and then less than the truth. But even the lighter version rearranged her mouth into sorrow. "People forget that harmless isn't harmless when it's chosen for you," she said, and I wanted to hug a stranger for narrating my own marrow. After that, I said less and listened more. When other people talked about my story, I let the words pass over me like mist. I didn't correct, didn't amplify, didn't add. Zoe handled corrections with a scientist's apathy. "It wasn't poison," she told a teenager at the soft-serve machine. "They wanted Mom sick. There's a difference, but not enough of one." On the third night, as the ship hummed and Ryan scrolled headlines, I stared at the ceiling and considered a thought I'd avoided because it tasted like betrayal on my tongue. Maybe my mother had never learned to love me without turning me into a utility. The little favors, the be a good sister, the steady drafts from the account labeled daughter, maybe that had always been her definition. The cake was only shocking because it was edible. The rest had been swallowed for years. The trip became weirdly peaceful once I stopped performing pleasantness. I held Zoe's hand while we watched the shore excursion briefing, as if holding hands were still the way we crossed parking lots. She observed everything with an investigator's mind and a child's gift for saying the unsayable. When a cousin with a talent for opinion asked whether I planned to forgive, Zoe answered before I could assemble a sentence. "Forgiveness isn't a coupon you hand out at the door. It's a thing you do after someone stops doing the thing." The cousin blinked and decided dessert was more pressing than follow-ups. Ryan and I sat on the balcony the last night, the moon doing its ridiculous old trick of turning water into a light show. He didn't say "I told you so." He would never. He didn't say we should make peace. He knows what the word costs in our family. He said, "I'm proud you listened to her," and I felt my whole body unclench like a house that finally believes the storm passed. On the final morning, I woke early, went to the quiet part of the deck, and watched the wake unspool. I thought about all the mothers I know who carry hope like heavy groceries, who teach their daughters to apologize for the volume of their happiness, who prepare their sons to expect a yes. I thought about my own mother, her certainty that the world could be corrected if she moved its pieces around enough. I thought about how power makes people forget the difference between help and control. I thought about the tiny, precise bravery of a 12-year-old who didn't wait to be asked to speak. When we disembarked, the port smelled like burnt coffee and sunscreen. We went home to a house that looked the same, but wasn't. I didn't call my parents. I didn't text Paige. I did open my laptop. Somewhere in our county, a lab was dividing frosting into facts. I waited the way you wait for a storm track to update, pretending the map would undo the clouds. The report arrived with bureaucratic politeness, a mild but targeted laxative compound at a concentration likely to result in acute gastrointestinal distress for 24 to 48 hours. No long-term harm anticipated. Consistent with intentional adulteration for the purpose of incapacitation. Possible source match to a specific over-the-counter product. Clinical distant incontrovertible. I highlighted the relevant lines because that is what you do when you know people will claim not to have seen them. Then I did something I would have sworn I didn't have the stomach, for I posted the page to my mother's public prayer post with no caption. It wasn't vengeance. It was a mirror, and I had decided that this once I would let everyone see themselves. Type continue to receive the next part. The comments collected like rain in a city that doesn't understand gutters. Friends from high school gasped in lowercase. An aunt wrote a devotional about trials producing perseverance and accidentally proved my point. Someone I hadn't spoken to in 15 years messaged to ask whether the cake had tasted odd, and I almost laughed because the whole story was about the single fact that I had not tasted it. Paige sent me a thumbs down emoji without words, which was either restraint or contempt, and both were familiar. 2 days later, my banking app reminded me that the recurring transfer to mortgage page would run the next morning. I hovered over the rule with a small private ceremony of breath and then deleted it. I waited for the shrapnel of that silence to find me. It didn't. I thought of all the times I had preempted rage by cushioning truth and wondered how many other storms would have died in the air if I had simply refused to build them. The formal part of the fallout arrived with less drama than I expected. The county charged my mother with reckless endangerment. Her lawyer negotiated a path that ended in probation, a fine, and a tidy paragraph for news briefs no one would clip and save. She requested to swap the fine for community service and began volunteering at a church food pantry. I saw a photo on social media of her holding a clipboard, righteous kindness wrapping around her like a halo. On paper, people change in such beautiful fonts. Paige hired an attorney who announced she'd known nothing, who described her as blindsided by a mother's unfortunate lapse in judgment, who insisted she'd been in the living room the entire time discussing centerpieces. The story worked well enough for court. It did not land in my bones. I learned during the soft days after the report how much energy I had spent narrating my life for other people. I stopped. When people approached me with gossip disguised as concern, I made tea and let them talk until they ran out of oxygen, then nodded and said nothing useful. In the quiet that followed, my world got both smaller and brighter. Zoe kept the police summary saved in her notes app, like a talisman against gaslighting. She did not brandish it. She did not need to. The existence of proof rearranged the air around us. We developed new rituals that slid into the old ones' places. On Fridays, instead of checking that a transfer had gone through, I took Zoe for cheap noodles at a place where the floor was always slightly sticky and the soup could solder a week back together. On Sunday evenings, instead of editing my voice into the form of a daughter my mother admired, I read a book that did not try to improve me. Ryan asked fewer careful questions and shared more ordinary thoughts. He told me his favorite scene in a movie for no reason, described a cat he saw in the hardware store, announced that he wanted to learn how to make bread, and then produced a loaf that could have taken a nail. We laughed the kind of laughter that cracks open a room and lets air in. People like to say that truth sets you free, as if the freedom is instant and glamorous. In reality, it looks like this the first Saturday you don't spend preparing for a phone call that will ask you to be smaller than your skin. The first Tuesday you notice you haven't clenched your jaw since lunch. The quiet joy of grocery shopping without wondering whether you should buy extra for someone who will complain about the brand anyway. Freedom is so ordinary, it's almost shy. It arrives without makeup and sits at your table chewing a carrot while you relearn the names of your own preferences. Not everything softened. My father sent a message asking whether we could all meet in a neutral place to talk it out. I pictured a beige restaurant where the waiter's smile would get dragged into our undertow and told him no. He wrote that family is complicated and that forgiveness is the glue. I told him I was no longer adhesive. He didn't reply. For months, the absence of my parents became the quietest object in every room. Then 9 months after the cake and the cops and the ocean, my doorbell rang at noon, the exact time Hope likes to ambush you. I looked through the peephole and saw my parents standing on the mat like a postcard of themselves. My mother held a covered casserole. My father shifted like he might evaporate. "We wanted to talk," she said when I opened the door. I did not ask them in. We stood like a small funeral complete with food. My mother said the words she thought would work: mistake, bad idea. Desperate missing Zoe, regretted everything, still family. I heard each one and watched it dissolve before it could land. I said as kindly as I could, with my heart held steady in both hands, that family doesn't do what they did and then call it a misunderstanding. She offered the casserole. Tuna, she said, like a joke might turn into absolution. I took it, and when they left, put it in the trash with a lid that shut the way. I want my boundaries to shut firm, unambiguous, not violent. After I sat at the kitchen table where Zoe had once declared dibs on the top bunk of a ship and thought about the ways endings make space for things we don't know we need. The house made a sound the HVAC repairman swears is normal. I decided to believe him. That night, I walked past Zoe's room and heard the half-whisper of keys. She was typing, probably finishing homework she had started too late, because a brain like hers likes to sprint at midnight. I knocked and opened the door. She spun with mock drama and announced she had designed a browser extension to warn you when a message is manipulative. We could use that for emails from the grandparents, she said, then grinned like a fox that found a loophole. I kissed the top of her head, breathing in coconut conditioner and the defiant relief of a life that's beginning. We didn't press charges beyond what the state had set in motion. Some people told me I was soft. Others told me I was ruthless. I am finally uninterested in their math. Here is mine. They did a thing that required the legal system to say a word out loud. That word was enough. I do not need more sentences to explain what I will no longer hold. And I do not need a reconciliation that teaches my daughter that speaking up gets you punished with proximity. If there is a heaven where everything gets sorted into neat labeled bins, maybe my mother will put away the sugar and learn the difference between food and control. On Earth, I am learning the difference between nostalgia and love. Type, continue to receive the next part. Time makes you brave by accident. You wake up one morning and realize you have been living the life you chose for longer than the one you didn't. The first autumn after the cake, the leaves in our neighborhood conducted their annual drama with a little more conviction, or maybe I was the one with more eyes. I started running again, slow, stubborn loops that told my lungs we were still on speaking terms. Ryan's bread got less dangerous. Zoe joined a robotics club and announced that her goal was to build a machine that could identify manipulation in a room the way carbon monoxide detectors identify what wants to steal your breath. Some evenings, when the house had that good used feeling and the dishes were done, we would sit on the porch and do nothing, which turned out to be the most decadent thing. I didn't become a saint. I still sometimes opened a blank message to my mother and then closed it when the muscle memory of justification tried to reclaim me. I still had dreams where the cake was a wedding, the frosting, a veil, my fork, a kind of vow. I still felt the old tug to apologize for the shape of my life, but the tugs got quieter, like someone slowly turning down the volume on a radio that isn't tuned to any station you love. People ask now and then whether I think my mother is sorry. I think she is sorry she got caught in a story where the villain isn't allowed to be the hero. I think she misses the version of me she could organize. I think she tells herself she had no choice, that the dream of a whole family in matching t-shirts was worth a few bad hours in a bathroom, that love sometimes requires a stomachache. I think the words "I did it for you" have served her well in rooms where people are too polite to answer. No, you did it for your idea of me. I do not know whether that is sorrow. I do know that it is not repair. Repair requires putting down the hammer. I used to think forgiveness was a door that only opened if the other person knocked with the right rhythm. I have come to believe it is a window you open for yourself to let air in. Some days, I open it all the way. Some days, I crack it and stand with my hand on the frame listening. The lesson is not tidy. The lesson is that you do not have to eat what you are served just because someone you love put it on a plate and told you it was your favorite. The lesson is that the first time you say no, you will tremble, and the second time you will tremble less, and the third time you will wonder why your hands ever shook. The lesson is that the child who learns to advocate for you will teach you to advocate for yourself, and that handing the microphone to the bravest person in the room might be the most maternal thing you ever do. Once, months after everything had settled into its new durable shape, I ran into my aunt at the grocery store, and we performed the ballet of small talk near the oranges. She said carefully that the church food pantry had been good for my mother, that serving can soften you. I said I hoped so. She nodded, then added, "You know, grief makes people do wild things." I thought about how the sentence demanded that I grieve the family I didn't have instead of the one I did. I smiled and said, "Boundaries make people do brave things too," and then we both reached for a bag and laughed like the world was not tilted. On the anniversary of the night with the cake, Zoe asked if we could bake something ugly on purpose. We made a chocolate sheet cake that looked like a small happy disaster, the frosting stubborn in all the wrong ways. We ate it in the living room with our knees pulled up like kids at a sleepover, and I thought about how healing sometimes arrives with a fork and a joke. We didn't give the cake a speech. We didn't photograph it. We didn't post. We just ate and said it was good because it was, and because no one needed it to do anything but be. If you are waiting for a grand moral, here is the closest I can offer without lying. Love is not proof of goodness. Love is capacity. What matters is what you do when your love and your need for control collide. Once upon a time, my mother taught me to hand over my favorite things to make peace. My daughter handed me back my name in a whisper and said, "Keep it." I am keeping it. If you have ever sat at a table where the air insisted you take a bite of something your body did not want, I hope you hear me. You do not owe your hunger to anyone else's happiness. You are allowed to be full of your own life. You are allowed to leave food on the plate. You are allowed to build a family that believes you the first time. We still don't talk to my parents. Maybe one day there will be a conversation that isn't an argument disguised as a prayer. Maybe there won't. Either way, when I look at Zoe across a room, the music in the scene is not horror anymore. It is a simple, low, steady thread that holds. She asked me recently whether she went too far calling the police. I told her she went exactly as far as the truth required. She rolled her eyes and said, "That's such a mom answer." I said I'm finally comfortable being one. Then she hugged me with the ferocity of a person who wants to make sure you're still here, and satisfied stole the last piece of ugly cake. If I'm lucky, our lives will be crowded with ordinary decisions and unremarkable dinners. We will say no when we mean no, and yes only when it is a yes we can live with. We will teach ourselves every day that love without respect is choreography, and love with respect is rest. We will stand in kitchens and porches and grocery store aisles and practice the kind of gentleness that has a spine. And if a doorbell rings with a casserole and a script, we will open the door or we won't, but either way, we will know that our health is not collateral for anyone else's dream. Like, share, and subscribe if this story made you breathe easier, and tell me in the comments the moment you realized a boundary saved you. Your voice might be the whisper someone else needs to hear.